Hi everybody, it's Cary Fridley, and I'm here to go over the classical music history timeline with you. We're going to briefly look at all the ages that the timeline covers and talk about historical events and especially musical contributions of each era. Before I go over the timeline, I just want to say that the history of classical music is Western European music history. And one of the reasons we use this timeline is because there has been a lot of influence from Western European classical music history, and in America and in North Carolina, where we are, there is musical notation that comes from this tradition. The tonality, using major and minor to evoke different feelings and moods. Using scales, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, basing songs and the folk traditions. So, and not to mention the influence of jazz on all these traditions, which is where America got involved. And that brings in West African traditions from the roots of jazz. So by studying this timeline, we can learn a lot about the history of music that influenced popular music in America. So I hope you find it somewhat relevant, and if not, you'll learn something new. Let's look at the timeline that I made for you that's on Moodle. So I have it here. Let's go to the timeline. And as you see, the very first age, the Middle Ages, is the Middle Ages. The medieval period is the longest one. It covers the most years. But in the whole scheme of things, this is the time period that we have the least amount of evidence, because most people were illiterate. The people that had the books and kept records were the people in the church, and also at court, the kings and queens. Near the end of the Middle Ages, the church codified their chants. Pope Gregory was in charge of this, and he wrote them all down. And they sang the same melodies for each Bible verse. The monks would practice this every day, and it would be part of the church service. So when he wrote them down, he had to invent a system of notation, or the monks did. And that's the first time we start to see the lines and the notes on the spaces in the lines. So that is the most important contribution we get to music from the medieval period in Western European classical music, is notation. They made a system of writing the notes down so that you could remember it and sing it the same way each time and share it with others. And this system stuck, and we use a variation of this system today. Now, there were other systems that pre-existed this and in other parts of the world, but this system is the most widely used in the world today. So in the medieval period, remember church and kings and queens, court, the Gregorian chants, and at the end, they're starting to write things down and be able to share with others. Now, in the Renaissance period, we get the printing press, and also some new ideas about philosophy and singing in church, religion, that stem from the release of the books and people learning to read, and they can read the old philosophies from Plato and Aristotle. And singing at church changed. They started having new compositions. They started having all different voices singing at different times, because in medieval times, the chant was one voice. In the Renaissance, they used many voices and intertwined them, and this is new and exciting. They publish singing books and instrumental music books using the printing press that people can buy. And there's a rise of the middle class where music is now part of society. You don't have to be at court or in church to learn how to do music, and you can sing and play music with your friends. So that happens in the Renaissance period. Right at the end of the Renaissance, we start to move into opera. And that's what's going to define the Baroque period. Now, the Baroque period, looking at our page here from 1600 to 1750, this is exciting. They're starting to have ensembles with instrumental music composed for court musicians. And the most popular type of music is chamber music. Small ensembles, little orchestras, string quartets. And the instruments are getting better. They're playing in tune better. Instrument builders are getting better at all that. The violin is the most important instrument. They have the instruments divided into two groups, inside and outside. Usually loud and soft. The loud is the horns often, and the softer ones are the strings inside. In the Baroque era, we get some important composers like J.S. Bach, who writes all kinds of music, but organ music and keyboard music for everyone to learn at home, and church music, beautiful choral pieces. And he studies the art of composition and creates rules to follow to create tension and release using combinations of notes. So that influences the rest of the history timeline. The most important type of performance in the Baroque era is the opera. And singing and poetry is king. The music is there mostly to accompany the poetry. If it's instrumental music, you want an instrument that sounds like a human voice singing out. Opera is a multimedia experience. The definition of opera is a play that is entirely sung. So every word of dialogue is sung. You have big numbers. Those are called the arias. And then you have quick little dialogue that is sung on pitch. We've got to go over and get in the carriage and go to the next town and see my cousin. Things like that to keep the plot moving along. But the arias are the big numbers that show off the famous singers, the professional singers' vocal abilities. Now moving on to the classical era. In Western Europe, they decided what type of music they liked and what type of ensembles were important. Renaissance and Baroque were kind of experimental, very inventive, lots of different kinds of things going on. And in the classical, they love a certain type of form called sonata form, where the composer presents a theme. Then they go away from that theme Maybe you go to a different key, or go to minor, or change to an alternate theme, to where you feel like you're lost. And then at the end, they bring the theme back, and it's full circle, and you're like, oh, I'm back home. And that's the very basics of sonata form. And that was the most popular thing in the classical era. This is the era of Mozart. The father of the symphony is at the beginning of the classical era, and his name is Haydn, Haydn, Joseph Haydn. And he standardizes the symphony with the sonata form, with the certain instruments, this many of this, this many of that. And he writes the symphony, which is the #1 contribution of the classical era to classical music, the symphony. And this is the first time they've really had full large-scale works just for the orchestra. Before, the orchestra was part of the opera. You might have a chamber orchestra, but it's usually to accompany a soloist in the Renaissance and in the Baroque era. But now, the orchestra has its own pieces, the symphonies written in sonata form, and that is the most important thing in the classical era. In the beginning, we have Haydn. In the middle, we have Mozart. And in the end, we have Beethoven. Beethoven is in 2 eras. His early material, the bulk of his life is in the classical era, and then they say he starts to move towards the Romantic near the end of his life, and his final symphony catapults us into the Romantic era. Beethoven's Ninth, and you might remember the theme. Dun 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 dun. And he opens up a whole new world of possibilities with how he wrote that symphony. So let's look at the Romantic era from 1820 to 1900. And this is when there's a lot of unrest in Europe. We're talking about the French Revolution and revolutions all over the place. There's a lot of nationalism in the music. So French music sounds like it's from France, and Italian music sounds like it's from Italy, and German music sounds like it's from Germany. And everyone's proud of their heritage, and they want their people to be united how they feel like they should be united. So there are a lot of wars, and the music reflects the storm and stress of war. Germany is very important during the Romantic era. Beethoven is from Germany, and they have a whole movement called Sturm und Drang, which is storm and stress. It's a literary movement that started in Germany, and Beethoven used it in his music, and Wagner, a new composer on the scene in the Romantic era, used it in his operas. And he wrote important operas, most notably The Ring Cycle, which is one of the longest operas ever written. You'll learn more about him when we get to the Romantic era, but his tonalities are very lush, bigger orchestras, different colors of combinations in the orchestra. So an expansion of music in the Romantic. Bigger is better in the Romantic. And at the turn of the century, in 1900, we start moving towards modern music. And one of the most influential things that happen in the modern times is jazz in America, which has elements of West African music, which has nothing to do with Western European music. So it really shook things up. And it opened up a whole new world to composers in classical music, and they started entering things. They started including things like improvisation in a classical music piece, syncopation, like African drum rhythms, soloistic passages that sound like jazz in the classical music. And this really changed how everything sounded. Moving along through the century, in the 1950s, you get electronic music and experimental music, minimalists. So things really get turned on their head in the modern era of classical music, and it really leads to where we are now. They call it postmodernist, and that is where anything goes. That all the old structures have been questioned and turned upside down and picked through, and you make music with like a collage with what we have learned from the past, or doing the opposite of what we've learned, or using a whole different culture and applying the rules of another type of music to it, and trying anything. I think the internet is part of the expansion in our postmodernist world. All right, that is the basics of the music history timeline. I hope this helps give you an idea of how things are organized in classical music history of Western European style music, and how it's relevant to the music today. Your book breaks down the history into a section of chapters for each era. So if you want to learn more detail, you can go to the book and look up a section that's of interest to you. And as always, I'm available if you have any questions for me. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoy learning more about classical music.